All right. So this set of slides talks about audio and specifically speech audio. And one of the important achievements of signal processing related to our ability to communicate in acoustic domain is so-called the voder or the vocoder, which the vocoder stands for voice encoder decoder, um, and then how we can actually use synthetic voice to express ourselves. So either going from text to speech or speech to text is kind of an inverse problem, and the same techniques could apply to both. So kind of the history of the voder, and just making sure that I have the computer sound. Went all the way back to 1939 in New York, where Bell Labs presented this kind of a voice typewriter. And it was based on the idea that you could actually manipulate the frequency contents of a signal by creating a bunch of filters. So this time, we're not talking about FFTs, we're talking about actual filters, electronic filters. This mechanism consists of 10 bandpass filters, wrist switches that could switch here between buzz and hiss, and I'll talk about why we need buzz or hiss, and then foot pedal that would control the speed of the buzz or the pitch. Okay, so this one is the pitch bias, and there were actually typists who were trained to manipulate the frequency contents of the signal that was either pitched or unvoiced, that went through these filters to create a speech. So let me briefly kind of demonstrate or play an example of how the voder sounds.
Greetings, everybody. Greetings, everybody.
So by playing around with these with the switches, the person was trained actually to express the changes in frequencies based on manipulating the spectrum, could actually do quite convincing spoken synthetic voice. I put a link to video here. Let me kind of see if we can play some excerpts of this here, and then I'll make sure that you have them also on the slides. Okay, where's the volume?
Who saw you?
She saw me.
Whom did she see?
She saw me.
Well, did she see you or hear you?
She saw me.
Now, so far, you have only heard the voder speak in one voice. But the voder has other voices which he can use when Miss Harper makes a simple adjustment in his mechanism. Helen, will you have the voder say, "Greetings, everybody"?
Greetings, everybody.
Now, will you have him repeat that in a high voice?
Greetings, everybody.
And now, in his best bass.
Greetings, everybody.
When a boy's voice changes.
So it's a fun video to watch, and it actually makes noises of animals, and talks about how long it took the typists to train. And the most amazing thing was that Bell Labs didn't see any use for this technology. They just thought it's a fun experiment, pretty much in the physics of sound, or how you can electronically generate sounds that sound like speech. But it kind of brings the basic model that then was elaborated. And that is that by controlling the overall frequency contents of speech, which we'll refer later as the formants, and having an excitation which is either buzz, which is the pitched, or hiss, which is the unvoiced portion, and we'll talk about this a little bit more, and passing this through a filter, you actually can generate acoustic signals that sound a little bit like speech. Pretty much at the same time, in parallel, there was another mechanism or another device that was supposed to generate speech, so-called pattern playback in Haskell's laboratories. And it consisted of quite an interesting mechanism. If you remember, we spoke about piano rolls that encoded notes. This one is an encoding of a spectrogram as kind of a picture. Now, the way it's generated is that you have a tone wheel that actually generates the pitch, it generates the excitation, which is the periodic signal. And again, the whole idea of source filter model, where something that is going through, there is a source, in this case, this wheel will create a pitch, it will create something that is periodic signal, and then it's filtered through this spectrogram. Okay, so these will be the partials, and this will be a way to mask them, so they only are passed through certain regions of the frequency. And this kind of a tape that somebody would know how to draw would be able to create speech. Okay, now one important thing to notice here, these are not the partials, these are not the individual harmonics of the speech. The harmonics were generated by the stone wheel here. These are much broader areas of which frequency bands are allowed to pass, or which frequency bands are actually going through. And in case of these noisy kind of dots, the idea was to generate the bands of random random sounds that will be more corresponding to noise. So if you run this tape through the pattern playback device, this is what you would get.
These days, the chicken wing is a rare dish.
And you can notice that one of the difficulties here is that the pitch itself is constant because this tone wheel is fixed, and actually the spacing on the tone wheel creates the pitch. But by letting bands of frequencies go through, you can actually create quite an intelligible pronunciation.
These days, the chicken wing is a rare dish.
So we'll kind of use this idea that these patterns actually encode the spoken words, while the pitch itself has to be controlled. And in the voder, to make it more expressive, the typist could actually change the pitch. You could create fluctuations in the intonation. You can also create vibrato. You can kind of sing with this one, while with this one it will be playing everything on a constant pitch. And the last kind of historical introduction, kind of to motivate into what we are trying to do today. This is 30 plus years later, an automatic translation of English text to phonetics by means of letter to sound rules from the Department of Navy Office of Naval Research. It's a system that tries actually to generate. So this is kind of text to phonetics, text to speech system. And the way it works is really trying to use this idea that if you know the relations between the phonetic transcription, okay, the phonemes and the sibilants and the plosives. I mean, of course, it's much richer vocabulary than what we're going to do in the next set of slides. But if you know these patterns, you know how they should sound, or you know what will be their spectral imprint or their spectral template, you could then sequence them and generate a speech. So this whole process or the program that is described in this document actually takes a text. So this is kind of like an example from that report of running this code. You start the program, it asks you if you want to type in something and what translation do you want. And it has more than one phonetic alphabet. This is the International Phonetic Alphabet result. And you type in a text. Okay, so the text is, the time has come, the walrus said, to talk of many things, of shoes and ships and sealing wax and cabbages and kings. And what the system does, it actually maps this to this phonetic alphabet. So that time is created with de. This is one phonetic, de and ah, de, I'm, has, come. So this is your phonetic transcription of a text, and this phonetic transcription is then passed to speech synthesizer that could either be heard on speaker headphones, recorded, or sent over a modem to some other system that will generate. So one way to think about this is really as a super efficient encoding. Now the question is, so encoding for what? The big success of the vocoder came later in the Second World War as basically a way to transmit speech, but you would speak into the vocoder. It will encode this into these spectral shapes and voiced, unvoiced, and this will be our linear prediction topic in the next set of slides. And then it will reconstruct the speech. Here, you don't even need to send the speech. You send even much more compressed version as a text, which is then translated to phonetic patterns, and these patterns are synthesized. So today, if we want to think about this as a problem for machine learning, one earlier attempt, which is pretty much the state of the art, is so-called concatenative synthesis. And what concatenative synthesis does is basically it uses a large database of recorded conversations, and it is able to index or extract a set of recordings. So it's a little bit like a musical synthesizer, where a sampler, where you record individual notes. But in the case of speech, you actually have long segments of phonemes, diphones, and other subsequences of sounds, which then are concatenated. They also have to be kind of manipulated and matched together, and the pitch has to be corrected. But the idea is that you can basically reuse samples from a large speech database to create new speech. Now, the next step was, well, we don't want to reuse a database. We'll use deep learning approach that will generate something by encoding the speaker. So kind of just relating this briefly to music, a lot of the improvisation systems that I've been showing in the previous slides, where we use, let's say, LMPLZ or some other indexing method into a recording, are generating new music by concatenation. We go back to the original data. It could be a MIDI file, it could be an audio file. We find the continuations which exist in the recording, and we're able to play them back. In deep learning, you try basically to start from scratch, in the sense that you generate everything on the level of of the program, because your learning model kind of encodes already this knowledge in a generative way. So the elements of a modern deep learning speech synthesis, and similar ideas people are trying to use also for singing synthesis and musical synthesis. The idea is that you have to start with some kind of a symbolic representation, graphing or phoneme sequence, and then you use an encoder that combines the knowledge of what you want to say with some representation of a speaker. So this is kind of an important thing, because every speaker will have his own voice, his own style of speaker. You basically concatenate them together, and then you pass this to well, in this case, it's an RNN with attention. We have seen just a graph of tachotron in some of the previous slides, and this will generate a spectrogram, log MEL spectrogram, or some other frequency representation that then will be passed to a vocoder. And the name here of a vocoder is really the idea of taking a spectrum, taking a spectral representation, and turning this into waveform. So going back to the idea of a vocoder, so this is a spectral representation that is being generated into a waveform. This is very partial representation. This is also a voder or vocoder because it takes a spectral representation typed as spectrum keys and this buzz, hiss, and the pitch. and generates a sound. So kind of the idea of a vocoder is this end piece in the whole process of going from symbolic to waveform, passing through some step where you do land yourself in a frequency domain or time frequency domain, which is then generated. Okay, so this is kind of a brief review of the history of speech synthesis and concatenative methods, deep learning methods as the kind of the new ways of doing this in a much higher quality. All right, let's see.